A lot of people don't realize this until it's too late. But once you reach a certain age, even small updates in driving regulations can quietly affect something as important as your independence on the road. And for drivers over 65, recent DMV policy adjustments in several jurisdictions are being discussed more seriously than ever before in terms of renewal procedures, vision standards, and periodic assessments. Now here's the question. Do you think driving ability should be evaluated strictly by age, or should it only be based on individual performance regardless of age? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now let's break this down carefully and professionally. In my legal analysis, driver's license regulation in the United States is primarily a state-level responsibility, meaning each DMV operates under its own statutory framework. However, most states follow similar constitutional principles of reasonableness and public safety when designing rules for license renewal, especially for senior drivers. Historically, licensing systems were never designed around age alone. They were built around competence, vision standards, reaction time, and safe vehicle operation. Over time, as populations have aged, many states have introduced additional screening mechanisms for older drivers, not as punishment, but as a public safety measure intended to ensure continued driving ability. Courts would likely examine whether such DMV rules are applied uniformly, fairly, and without discriminatory intent. Under constitutional standards, age-based regulation is generally evaluated under rational basis review, meaning the state must show that the policy is reasonably related to a legitimate government interest, such as road safety. Now, when we talk about possible DMV rule changes affecting drivers 65 and older, we are usually referring to things like more frequent license renewals, mandatory vision testing, or in some cases, brief cognitive or reaction assessments. These are not automatic restrictions on driving rights, but procedural safeguards intended to assess ongoing fitness to drive. In my legal analysis, the key constitutional question is not whether the state can regulate driving, it clearly can, but whether the method of regulation is fair, consistent, and based on safety rather than arbitrary classification. From a Fourth Amendment perspective, these rules generally do not raise search and seizure issues because they are administrative, not investigative. However, Fifth Amendment principles can become indirectly relevant if any required disclosures or assessments are used in broader legal or administrative decisions. Now let's talk about real-world impact. For senior drivers, the most important practical consequence of these policies is not loss of rights, but increased responsibility in maintaining valid documentation and meeting renewal requirements. Many drivers continue operating safely well beyond traditional retirement ages, and courts have consistently supported the idea that ability, not age alone, should determine driving eligibility. Supporters of enhanced DMV screening for older drivers argue that these measures improve public safety, reduce accident risk, and ensure that all drivers on the road meet minimum operational standards. They emphasize that periodic evaluation is a normal part of licensing, not a restriction of rights. On the other hand, critics argue that overly frequent or burdensome testing could create unnecessary barriers for seniors who are still fully capable of safe driving, and that policies should focus more on individual assessment rather than broad age categories. In my legal analysis, courts would likely continue supporting a balanced approach that allows states to implement safety-based screening while avoiding blanket assumptions about age. Now, from a federal versus state perspective, there is no single national DMV standard. That means these rules can vary significantly depending on where a person lives. However, constitutional equal protection principles still apply across all states, ensuring that any policy must have a rational connection to safety objectives. Now let's consider long-term implications. As populations continue to age, DMV policies are likely to evolve further, potentially incorporating more technology-based assessments, standardized testing methods, or medical certifications. The legal system will continue evaluating whether these changes remain fair, consistent, and constitutionally reasonable. In my legal analysis, the long-term trend is not toward restriction, but toward individualized assessment, where the focus is less on age categories and more on actual driving capability. Now, as we close this discussion, the most important takeaway is this. These DMV rule changes are not designed to take away independence. They are designed to ensure safety and confirm that every driver on the road, regardless of age, meets consistent standards of responsibility. So here's the final question to reflect on. Do you think DMV evaluations for senior drivers should become more frequent for safety reasons, or do you think they should remain minimal unless a clear issue arises? Share your thoughts in the comments. A respectful conversation on this topic matters because it affects millions of families across the country. And if you want more clear, fact-based explanations of legal and policy changes that affect everyday life, make sure to subscribe for future updates. Because at the end of the day, driving laws are not just about rules on paper. They are about real independence, real responsibility, and real decisions that shape how freely people move through their daily lives. Continuing from where we left off, the most important thing to understand is how these DMV policies actually function in practice once they move from written regulation into real-world enforcement. In my legal analysis, the key point is that most senior driver rule changes are not sudden or automatic license removals. Instead, they operate through a gradual administrative process. That means renewal cycles, documentation requirements, and sometimes additional screening steps are introduced in stages, giving drivers the opportunity to comply and demonstrate continued fitness to drive. Courts would likely examine whether those procedures are applied consistently and whether drivers are given fair notice and reasonable opportunity to meet the requirements. That is an essential part of due process under the 14th Amendment, even in administrative systems like DMV licensing. Now, from a practical standpoint, one of the most misunderstood aspects of these policies is the assumption that age itself is the deciding factor. In reality, in most jurisdictions, age is only a trigger point for additional review, not an automatic determination of ability. In my legal analysis, this distinction is critical because it reflects the broader constitutional principle that government decisions affecting personal rights or privileges must be based on individualized assessment whenever possible. Now let's connect this to real-world impact again. For families, these rules often become relevant during renewal periods. A driver may be asked to complete a vision test, provide updated medical information, or in some cases take a short on-road evaluation. These steps are designed to confirm safety, not to punish or restrict. Supporters of these DMV updates argue that they help reduce accident risk and ensure that all drivers maintain consistent safety standards regardless of age. They see these measures as part of responsible governance, especially in regions where traffic density and road complexity are increasing. On the other hand, critics emphasize that independence is closely tied to mobility, and that overly strict or frequent assessments could unintentionally create stress or limit access for individuals who are still fully capable of safe driving. Courts would likely continue to uphold the principle that states have broad authority over licensing, as long as their policies remain rational, non-arbitrary, and focused on legitimate safety goals. Now let's talk about legal risk and compliance. For drivers, the most important legal risk is not criminal liability, but administrative non-compliance, such as missing renewal deadlines, failing required tests, or not updating necessary documentation. These are issues that can lead to temporary suspension, but they are generally procedural rather than punitive in nature. In my legal analysis, the system is designed to encourage compliance rather than create penalties, but it still requires awareness and responsibility from the individual driver. Now, looking at the broader constitutional perspective, the courts have consistently held that driving is a regulated privilege tied to public safety, not an absolute constitutional right in the same category as protected freedoms like speech or religion. However, once granted, that privilege must still be administered in a fair and constitutionally consistent way. That is why equal protection principles and due process standards remain central in DMV-related legal interpretations. Now, stepping back, the long-term direction of these policies is likely to continue evolving with technology. We may see more standardized digital testing, improved medical screening integration, and more data-driven evaluation methods in the future. Courts will likely be asked to review whether those systems remain fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory. In my legal analysis, the trend is toward modernization rather than restriction, meaning the system is slowly adapting to ensure safety without broadly limiting independence based on age alone. Now, as we conclude this breakdown, it's important to bring everything together clearly. These DMV rule changes are not about taking away rights arbitrarily. They are about balancing two important values: public safety on the roads, and individual independence for drivers who rely on their license for daily life. And when courts review these policies, they are not just looking at regulations on paper. They are evaluating how those regulations affect real people in real situations. So here is the final question to reflect on. Do you believe DMV policies for senior drivers strike the right balance between safety and independence? Or do you think they need further reform to better protect individual mobility? Share your thoughts in the comments. Respectful discussion helps bring clarity to policies that affect millions of families. And if you want more clear, fact-based breakdowns of laws and real-world regulations, make sure to subscribe for future updates. Because in the end, legal rules are not just systems on paper. They are everyday decisions that quietly shape independence, safety, and the way society moves forward together.